Their own children threw them out on Christmas Eve with nothing but a suitcase and a prayer. But what this elderly couple would find in a frozen mansion 3 days later would silence every person who ever doubted their worth. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The snow had already begun to fall when Harold pressed his weathered palm against the frosted window of his son's living room. He watched the flakes drift down like tiny pieces of heaven, soft and quiet, the kind of snow that used to make his grandchildren squeal with joy. Christmas Eve had always been his favorite night of the year, not for the presents or the feast, but for the feeling, the warmth of family gathered close, the sound of laughter bouncing off walls, the simple gift of togetherness. He was 73 years old. His hands were calloused from decades of factory work. His back curved slightly from years of bending over machines that built other people's dreams. But his eyes, still bright and kind, held the gentle light of a man who had lived honestly and loved deeply. Behind him, his wife Ruth hummed quietly in the kitchen, helping her daughter-in-law Vanessa prepare the Christmas ham. Ruth was 71, small-framed but sturdy, the kind of woman who could stretch $1 into a miracle and turn leftovers into a feast. She had been married to Harold for 52 years, and in all that time she had never once raised her voice in anger. Patience was her gift. Love was her language. They had moved in with their son Derek and his family 3 years ago, after Harold's pension dried up and the rent on their apartment became impossible. It wasn't supposed to be permanent, just a temporary stay until they got back on their feet. But months turned into years, and slowly, quietly, Harold and Ruth became fixtures in the house, helping with the grandchildren, contributing their social security checks, doing whatever they could to earn their keep. They never asked for much. A warm bed, a seat at the table, the chance to watch their grandchildren grow. But tonight, something felt different. Harold noticed it first, the way Derek avoided eye contact during dinner, the way Vanessa kept checking her phone, the hushed conversations that stopped whenever he or Ruth walked into the room. He chalked it up to holiday stress. Everyone got a little tense around Christmas. Bills piled up. Expectations grew heavy. He didn't want to make a fuss. After dinner, the grandchildren, Emma, who was 9, and little Marcus, just 6, were sent upstairs to bed early. That was unusual. Normally they stayed up late on Christmas Eve, too excited to sleep, begging for just one more story, one more cookie, one more minute by the tree. Harold sat in his usual chair by the fireplace, watching the flames dance. Ruth settled beside him on the worn love seat, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a scarf for Marcus. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Then Derek walked in. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, hands shoved deep in his pockets, jaw tight. He was 47 now, a man Harold barely recognized anymore. Somewhere along the way, the boy who used to ride on his father's shoulders had become someone else, someone harder, someone distant. "We need to talk," Derek said. Ruth looked up from her knitting, needles pausing mid-stitch. Harold straightened in his chair, a cold feeling creeping into his chest. "What's on your mind, son?" Harold asked, keeping his voice steady. Derek exhaled slowly, like he was bracing himself. Vanessa appeared behind him, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "We sold the house," Derek said flatly. "The deal closes in 2 weeks. We're moving to North Carolina. Vanessa's sister has a place down there, better schools for the kids, lower cost of living." Harold blinked. "Well, that's quite a decision. When were you planning to tell us?" "I'm telling you now." Ruth set down her knitting, her hands trembling slightly. "North Carolina is a long way, but I suppose we could make it work. We don't take up much space. We could help with the children just like we do here." "No!" Derek cut her off, his voice sharp. "You're not coming." The words hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Harold felt his heart stutter. I don't understand. Derek ran a hand through his thinning hair, frustration creeping into his tone. Look, this isn't easy for me either, okay? But we've been talking about this for months. You two, you're too much of a burden. The medical appointments, the pills, the way you can't keep up with the kids anymore. We can't do it, not in a new place, not with a fresh start. Ruth's voice came out barely above a whisper. A burden. Vanessa stepped forward, her tone clipped and businesslike. We've found a list of senior living facilities in the area. Some of them take Medicaid. You'll have options. Harold rose slowly from his chair, his legs unsteady beneath him. You're putting us out? On Christmas Eve? Derek wouldn't meet his eyes. The movers come the day after tomorrow. We need the house cleared. You can stay at the roadside inn tonight. I already called. They have a room. Ruth pressed a hand to her chest, as if trying to hold something inside from breaking. Derek, please, we're your parents. We've given you everything we had. Every paycheck, every prayer, every piece of ourselves. Doesn't that mean anything? For a moment, something flickered in Derek's eyes. Something that might have been shame, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. I'm sorry, he said, but this is how it has to be. Harold looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. The boy he had taught to ride a bike, the teenager he had bailed out of trouble more times than he could count, the young man he had walked down the aisle at his wedding. That person was gone, replaced by someone who could look his own father in the eye and tell him he wasn't wanted. Get your things, Vanessa said. The cab will be here in 20 minutes. Ruth didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply stood, walked to the small bedroom they had shared for 3 years, and began folding clothes into a single suitcase. Harold followed, his movements slow, mechanical, like a man walking through a dream he couldn't wake from. They packed in silence. There wasn't much to take. A few changes of clothes, Ruth's Bible, worn soft from decades of use, a photograph of their wedding day, black and white, the edges curling with age. Harold's old wristwatch, the one his own father had given him when he turned 18. When they came back downstairs, the grandchildren were nowhere to be seen. Harold paused at the bottom of the stairs, hoping for one last glimpse, one last hug. But the house was silent. The cab arrived exactly on time. Derek opened the front door, letting in a gust of cold air and swirling snow. The inn is about 15 minutes away. They're expecting you. Harold stopped at the threshold. He turned to face his son one last time. I forgive you, he said quietly, not because you deserve it, but because carrying anger is too heavy for an old man. Derek said nothing. Ruth walked past without a word, her suitcase rolling behind her, her head held high despite the tears freezing on her cheeks. The cab pulled away from the curb, its headlights cutting through the falling snow. Through the rear window, Harold watched the house grow smaller, then disappear entirely into the white. Beside him, Ruth reached for his hand. Her fingers were cold, trembling. He held on tight. We'll figure this out, he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. We always do. The roadside inn was a squat building with a flickering neon sign and a parking lot half buried in snow. The woman at the front desk was kind enough, handing them a key to room 12 without too many questions. She glanced at their single suitcases, at their red-rimmed eyes, and simply said, Merry Christmas. The room was small and smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial cleaner. 2 twin beds with scratchy blankets, a television bolted to the wall, a window that looked out onto nothing but snow and darkness. Ruth sat on the edge of one bed, her hands folded in her lap. She stared at the wall for a long time before speaking. 52 years, she said softly. 52 years of marriage. 30 years of raising that boy, and this is how it ends. Harold sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her thin shoulders. It's not the end, it's just a turn in the road. We've survived worse. Have we? He didn't answer, because truthfully, he wasn't sure they had. That night, neither of them slept. They lay in the darkness, listening to the wind howl outside, the radiator clank and hiss, the distant sound of cars passing on the highway. Somewhere out there, families were gathered around Christmas trees, children were tearing open presents, laughter was filling homes. But here, in room 12 of the roadside inn, two people who had spent their entire lives giving to others found themselves with nothing. Christmas morning came grey and cold. Harold walked to the vending machine in the lobby and bought 2 packs of crackers and a cup of instant coffee. It was all they had money for. Their social security checks had already gone to Derek this month, as they always did. Ruth ate in silence, her eyes distant. Harold watched her and felt something break inside him that he didn't know how to fix. The next 3 days passed in a blur of survival. They stretched their remaining cash as far as it would go. Cheap meals from the gas station across the street, rationed heat, hours spent sitting in the motel lobby because it was warmer than their room. Harold called a few old friends, but no one answered. He tried the senior services hotline, but they were closed for the holidays. He even swallowed his pride and called Derek once, just to ask about the grandchildren. The call went straight to voicemail. By the 3rd day, their money was gone. The motel manager, a gruff man with a grey beard and tired eyes, told them checkout was at 11. No exceptions. Harold sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his empty wallet. Ruth stood by the window, watching the snow fall. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly. He didn't have an answer. Then the phone rang. Not Harold's cell phone. That had been disconnected months ago. The room phone. The one bolted to the nightstand that neither of them had touched since they arrived. Harold stared at it for a moment, confused. Who would be calling them here? He picked it up slowly. "Hello? Am I speaking with Harold Whitmore?" The voice on the other end was professional, clipped, with a slight New England accent. "Yes, this is Harold. Mr. Whitmore, my name is Franklin Pierce. I'm an attorney based in Montpelier, Vermont. I've been trying to reach you for several days. The motel was my last lead." Harold frowned. "An attorney? I'm sorry, I don't understand. We haven't done anything wrong." No, nothing like that." There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm calling on behalf of the estate of Colleen Ashford. I believe she was your wife's aunt." Harold glanced at Ruth, who was watching him with wide eyes. "Colleen? Ruth's Aunt Colleen? We haven't heard from her in, Lord, it must be 40 years. "Yes, well, I'm afraid Miss Ashford passed away 2 weeks ago. She was 97 years old, and she left behind a rather substantial estate." Harold's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm sorry to hear that, but what does this have to do with us?" "Everything, Mr. Whitmore. You see, Miss Ashford had no children, no living siblings, and no other heirs. In her will, she left her entire estate to her only remaining blood relative, your wife, Ruth." The room seemed to tilt. Harold pressed a hand against the nightstand to steady himself. "Her entire estate?" "Yes, sir. A property in northern Vermont. A mansion, actually, built in 1892. It's been in the Ashford family for 5 generations. Ruth had crossed the room now, standing close, her eyes fixed on Harold's face. "There's a condition, however," the attorney continued. "The will stipulates that the heir must take physical possession of the property within 7 days of notification. Today is day 4. You have 3 days remaining." Harold's mind raced. 3 days? But there's a blizzard. The news said roads are closed all across Vermont. "I'm aware, but I'm afraid the terms are non-negotiable. If you don't arrive by midnight on December 30th, the estate reverts to the state." Harold closed his eyes. "We don't have a car. We don't have money. We're sitting in a motel room with nothing but the clothes on our backs." There was a long pause. Then the attorney spoke again, his voice softer now. "Mr. Whitmore, I don't know your situation, and I'm not going to pretend I do. But I've spent 30 years handling estates, and I've never seen a will quite like this one. Colleen Ashford was particular. She waited until she found the right person to leave this to. For some reason, she chose your wife. Why? Ruth barely knew her. I can't answer that, but I can tell you this. If you find a way to get here, you won't regret it. This property, it's something special. Harold wrote down the address on the back of a receipt. Hartwell Road, Colton, Vermont. Then he thanked the attorney and hung up. Ruth stared at him. Harold, what is it? What did he say? He took a deep breath. Your Aunt Colleen. She passed away, and she left you everything. Ruth's hand flew to her mouth. Everything? But I only met her once when I was a little girl. She gave me a locket. I still have it somewhere. I know, but she remembered you. And now... He looked around the dingy motel room, at the stained carpet and the flickering light. Now we have to get to Vermont in 3 days, or we lose it all. Ruth's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness this time, but of something else, something that looked almost like hope. How? She whispered. How do we get there? Harold stood slowly, his old bones protesting. He walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered parking lot. There, at the far end, sat their 1994 Ford pickup, the one they'd driven to Derek's house 3 years ago, the one that had been sitting unused ever since. We drive, he said. Ruth stepped up beside him. Through a blizzard? Harold, the roads? I know. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. But what choice do we have? Stay here and wait to be thrown out? Go back to Derek and beg? He shook his head. I'd rather die in a snowdrift than crawl back to people who threw us away. Ruth studied his face for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. Then we drive. The truck started on the 3rd try, coughing and sputtering before the engine finally caught. Harold let it idle for a few minutes, watching the temperature gauge creep up, saying a silent prayer to whatever mechanical angels might be listening. They had $23 between them, enough for a tank of gas if they were lucky. Ruth found a bag of stale pretzels in the glove compartment. That would be their food for the journey. The first 100 miles were slow but manageable. The highways had been plowed, at least partially, and traffic was light. Harold kept both hands on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road, while Ruth navigated using an old paper map they'd found stuffed behind the seat. But as they crossed into Vermont, everything changed. The snow came down harder, faster, turning the world into a wall of white. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The road beneath them became treacherous, slick with ice. Twice, the truck fishtailed, and Harold had to fight to keep them from sliding into a ditch. Ruth prayed out loud, her voice steady and calm, a constant murmur of faith against the howling wind. They drove through the night, stopping only once at a gas station that was somehow still open. The attendant, a young man with a thick beard and kind eyes, looked at them like they were ghosts. You folks shouldn't be out in this, he said. Storm's only getting worse. We have to be somewhere, Harold replied simply. The young man nodded slowly, then refused to take their money for the gas. Merry Christmas, he said. Get there safe. They pressed on. By the morning of December 30th, the storm had finally begun to ease. The snow still fell, but softer now, and the wind had died down to a whisper. Harold's hands ached from gripping the wheel. His back screamed with every bump in the road. But they were close. According to Ruth's map, they were less than 10 miles from Colton. The final stretch was the hardest. The road narrowed to a single lane, bordered on both sides by towering drifts of snow. The truck groaned and struggled, its old tires fighting for traction. But it kept moving, mile by mile, minute by minute. And then, through the trees, they saw it. The mansion rose from the snow like something out of a dream, massive, stone covered in white. Its windows were dark, its chimneys cold, but even beneath the weight of decades of neglect, it held a kind of majesty that took their breath away. Harold brought the truck to a stop at the end of the long driveway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stared. "Is that it?" Ruth whispered. "That's it?" They climbed out of the truck slowly, their legs stiff, their bodies exhausted. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they walked toward the front entrance, a massive oak door flanked by stone columns. Harold tried the handle, locked. He looked around, searching for another way in. That's when Ruth noticed it, a small lockbox attached to the railing, half buried in snow. She brushed it off and saw a combination dial. "The attorney," she said suddenly. "He mentioned a code, 4 numbers. He said it was the year the house was built." Harold thought for a moment. 1892. Ruth entered the numbers slowly. 1, 8, 9, 2. The lockbox clicked open. Inside was a single brass key, tarnished with age but solid in her palm. She handed it to Harold. He slid it into the lock, turned it, and pushed. The door swung open with a groan that echoed through the empty halls. Cold air rushed out, carrying the scent of dust and old wood and something else, something that smelled like history, like secrets, like a life that had been waiting for them all along. They stepped inside together, their footsteps echoing on the marble floor of the grand foyer. A crystal chandelier hung overhead, draped in cobwebs but still magnificent. A sweeping staircase rose before them, leading up into darkness. Portraits lined the walls, faces from another era, watching in silence. Ruth turned slowly, taking it all in. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. "Harold," she breathed, "it's real. It's all real." He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. His own eyes were wet now, too. 3 days ago they had been thrown away like garbage, left to die in a motel room on Christmas Eve. Their own son had called them a burden. But now they stood in the foyer of a mansion that belonged to them, a place where no one could ever throw them out again. Harold looked up at the chandelier, at the staircase, at the endless hallways stretching into shadow. He didn't know what lay ahead. He didn't know what secrets this old house might hold. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something he thought he'd lost forever. Hope. "Welcome home," he whispered to Ruth. She leaned into him, her body trembling with exhaustion and emotion. "Welcome home," she whispered back. And somewhere deep within the walls of the Ashford mansion, in rooms that hadn't been opened in decades, a legacy was waiting to be discovered, one that would change their lives in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. The first night in the mansion was the coldest either of them had experienced in years. Harold and Ruth huddled together on an old velvet sofa in what appeared to be a sitting room just off the main foyer, wrapped in dusty curtains they had pulled down from the windows. The fireplace nearby was massive, built from riverstone, but they had no wood and no way to light it even if they did. Outside, the wind howled against the ancient walls, rattling windows that had weathered more than a century of Vermont winters. But inside, despite the cold, despite the darkness, despite everything, they were safe. They were home. Ruth pressed her face against Harold's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Do you think this is real?" she whispered. "Or are we dreaming?" Harold stroked her grey hair with fingers that had finally stopped trembling. "If it's a dream, I don't want to wake up." They slept in fits and starts, waking every few hours to the creak of old boards, the groan of settling timbers, the thousand small sounds of a house that had been left alone too long. But each time Harold opened his eyes, he saw the same thing: high ceilings, ornate mouldings, the faint outline of portraits watching from the walls, and each time he felt the same thing: gratitude. When morning finally came, weak winter light filtered through frost-covered windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Harold sat up slowly, his back protesting every movement. Ruth was already awake, standing at one of the tall windows, her breath fogging the glass. "Harold," she said softly, Come look." He joined her at the window, and together they gazed out at a world transformed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of pristine white. Snow blanketed everything, the grounds, the trees, the iron fence that surrounded the property, and in the distance, barely visible through the bare branches, they could see the rooftops of a small town. "Colton," Ruth murmured. "That must be it." Harold nodded. "We should explore the house today, see what we're working with. There has to be a way to get the heat running, or at least find some wood for that fireplace." Ruth turned to him, her eyes bright despite the exhaustion etched into her face. "Then let's get started." The mansion was even larger than it had appeared from the outside. They moved through it slowly, room by room, like archaeologists uncovering the ruins of a forgotten civilization. The ground floor alone contained a grand foyer, a formal dining room with a table that could seat 20, a sitting room, a parlor, a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a music room with a dusty grand piano, and a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1940s. Every room told a story. Every corner held a memory. In the dining room, they found china still stacked in glass cabinets, delicate patterns of blue and gold. In the parlor, a phonograph sat on a side table, a record still on the turntable, frozen mid-song from some night decades ago. In the music room, sheet music lay scattered across the piano bench, as if the player had simply stood up and walked away. Ruth ran her fingers along the piano keys, each one releasing a slightly out-of-tune note. "Someone loved this house once," she said quietly. "You can feel it." Harold nodded. "Your Aunt Colleen, she must have lived here alone for how long?" "The lawyer said she was 97 when she passed, if she inherited it from her husband and he died." Ruth paused, doing the math in her head. "She could have been alone here for 40 years, maybe more. 40 years alone in a house this size." The thought made Harold's chest ache. He wondered if Colleen had ever felt the way they had felt that night in the motel, abandoned, forgotten, invisible. But she had remembered Ruth. After all those years, she had remembered. They found the cellar door in the back of the kitchen, a heavy wooden thing with iron hinges. Harold expected it to be locked, but it swung open easily, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. "Wait here," he said. "Let me see if there's a light." He felt along the wall until his fingers found an old switch. He flipped it, not expecting anything, but to his surprise, a single bulb flickered to life overhead. "The electricity works," Ruth said, surprised. "Some of it anyway. The attorney must have had someone turn the power back on." They descended together, the air growing colder with each step. The cellar was vast, stretching beneath the entire footprint of the house. Stone walls, dirt floor, wooden shelves lining every surface. And on those shelves, food. Not fresh food, but preserved food. Jars of vegetables, canned fruits, dried beans, bags of rice sealed in plastic containers. There were bottles of water, too, and old wine bottles covered in dust. It was enough to survive on for weeks, maybe longer. Ruth pressed a hand to her heart. She was prepared, like she knew someone would need this someday. Harold picked up a jar of preserved peaches, turning it over in his hands. The date written on the label read 1987, nearly 40 years old, but the seal was still intact. "She was waiting," he said quietly, "waiting for us." Back upstairs, Harold turned his attention to the more practical matters of survival. The house had a furnace, an ancient oil-burning beast that sat in a utility room off the kitchen. He spent 2 hours examining it, cleaning what he could, checking connections and valves. Ruth found him lying on his back beneath the machine, a flashlight clenched between his teeth, hands black with grease. "Any luck?" she asked. He slid out from under the furnace and sat up, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I think I can get it running. The tank's about a quarter full, enough to heat the house for a few weeks if we're careful. But some of these parts," he shook his head, "they don't make them like this anymore." "You always did have a gift for fixing things," Ruth said, kneeling beside him. "Remember when our refrigerator broke back in '73? You kept that thing running for another 15 years. Harold chuckled, the first real laugh he'd managed in days. That refrigerator was held together with duct tape and prayer by the end. "But it worked." Ruth touched his cheek gently. "You always made things work." By late afternoon, the furnace rumbled to life. It groaned and coughed like an old man waking from a long sleep, but slowly, steadily, warmth began to spread through the mansion. Harold stood in the hallway, feeling the heat rise from the vents, and for the first time since Christmas Eve, he felt tears prick his eyes. They had heat, they had food, they had shelter. They were going to survive. That evening, they ate their first real meal in the mansion. Canned soup heated on an old gas stove, stale crackers they'd found in a sealed tin, and peaches from the cellar. They ate by candlelight in the kitchen, the furnace humming in the background, the house finally beginning to feel alive again. "Tell me about her," Harold said between spoonfuls of soup. "Your Aunt Colleen. What do you remember?" Ruth set down her spoon and gazed at the candle flame, her eyes distant. "I was only 6 when I met her. It was a family reunion somewhere in Massachusetts. She was already old then, or at least she seemed old to me. White hair, thin as a bird, but with these eyes." She smiled faintly. "Eyes that saw right through you." "What did she say to you?" "She asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. I told her I wanted to be a mother. She laughed, not meanly, just knowingly, and she said, 'That's the hardest job there is, but if you do it with love, nothing else matters.'" Ruth's voice caught. She looked down at her hands. "Then she gave me a locket, silver with a tiny flower engraved on the front. She said it had been her mother's and her grandmother's before that. She said she was giving it to me because she could tell I had a kind heart." "Do you still have it?" Harold asked. Ruth nodded. "It's in my suitcase. I've kept it all these years. Even when we had to sell everything else, I couldn't part with that locket." Harold reached across the table and took her hand. "She saw something in you, even back then, something worth remembering." "But why leave me all of this?" Ruth gestured at the house around them. "We were strangers. I sent her a Christmas card every year, but she never replied. I thought she'd forgotten me completely." "Maybe she was watching from a distance. Maybe she wanted to make sure you were the right person." Ruth was quiet for a long moment, then she squeezed his hand. "Whatever the reason, we're here now, and we're going to honor this gift." The next morning, they continued their exploration. The second floor held 8 bedrooms, each one frozen in time. 4-poster beds with canopies of faded silk, wardrobes filled with clothes from another era, vanity tables with silver brushes still laid out, waiting for someone who would never return. Ruth found a bedroom that she recognized immediately as Colleen's. It was smaller than the others, simpler, with a narrow bed pushed against the wall and a writing desk by the window. On the desk sat a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. She sat down and began to read. The letters spanned decades, correspondence between Colleen and her husband, a man named Edward Ashford. From what Ruth could piece together, Edward had been an inventor and businessman, someone who had made his fortune in the early 20th century through patents and investments. But there was more to the story than money. The letters spoke of love, deep and abiding, of hardship and loss, of a child who had died in infancy, of a world that had taken everything from them except each other. One letter, dated March 15, 1952, made Ruth's breath catch. "My dearest Colleen," it read, "the doctors say I have 6 months, perhaps less. I do not fear death. I fear only leaving you alone. Promise me you will protect what we've built, not for the money, but for the memory. Someone worthy will come someday, someone who understands that wealth without love is worthless. Wait for them, my darling. Wait and trust that heaven will send them to you." Ruth sat back, tears streaming down her face. "Harold," she called out. "Harold, come here." He appeared in the doorway, concern etched on his face. "What is it? What's wrong?" She handed him the letter. He read it slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something deeper. "He knew," Harold said quietly. "He knew someone would come. And she waited. For 70 years, she waited." They stood together in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. This wasn't just an inheritance, it was a responsibility, a legacy passed down through time, waiting for the right hands to receive it. That afternoon, Ruth made a discovery that changed everything. She was in the library, running her fingers along the spines of ancient books, when she noticed something strange. One section of the bookshelf didn't match the others. The wood was slightly different, the spacing between volumes uneven. She pulled out a few books and found a small brass lever hidden behind them. "Harold!" she called out again. He came quickly this time, still holding a wrench from his work on the plumbing. "Look at this," Ruth said, pointing to the lever. Harold examined it carefully. Some kind of mechanism, could be anything. "Should we pull it?" He hesitated, then nodded. "We've come this far." Ruth wrapped her fingers around the lever and pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft click, the entire bookshelf swung inward, revealing a narrow staircase leading up into darkness. Ruth gasped. "A hidden passage!" "To where?" Harold peered into the darkness. "The attic? Only one way to find out." They climbed the stairs together, Harold leading with a flashlight. The steps were narrow and steep, spiraling upward through the walls of the mansion. Dust floated in the beam of light, undisturbed for decades. At the top, they found a door, heavy, reinforced, with a lock that had long since rusted open. Harold pushed it open. The attic was enormous, spanning the entire length of the house, but it wasn't empty, far from it. Stacks of boxes lined the walls, filing cabinets stood in neat rows, wooden crates were piled high, their contents hidden beneath layers of dust. And in the center of the room, sitting on a raised platform like some kind of altar, was a safe. Not an ordinary safe. This was a vault, 6 feet tall, 4 feet wide, made of solid steel, with a combination dial the size of a dinner plate. What happens next will change their lives forever, uncover a truth decades in the making, and prove that sometimes the greatest treasures are found by those who have nothing left to lose. Stay tuned to see what they discover. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Ruth approached the safe slowly, as if approaching something sacred. "What is this place?" Harold moved through the room, opening boxes at random. Inside one, he found stacks of documents, legal papers, contracts, letters with official seals. Inside another, he found photographs, hundreds of them, showing factories, machines, people in work clothes standing proudly beside their creations. "These are patents," he said, pulling out a thick folder. "Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all in Edward Ashford's name." Ruth was examining the filing cabinets. Each drawer was labeled with a year, starting from 1908 and continuing all the way to 1952, the year Edward had written his final letter. "He was documenting everything," she murmured. "Every invention, every investment, every dollar." Harold opened another box and found something that made his heart stop. A letter, addressed simply, "To whoever inherits my burden." His hands trembled as he opened it. "My name is Colleen Ashford," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found your way to the truth. I have spent my life guarding what my husband built, not out of greed, but out of love. Edward believed that money was a tool, not a master. He believed that true wealth lay in what you did for others, not what you kept for yourself. When the banks failed in 1929, we lost everything we had trusted to others. But Edward had been cautious. He had kept the most valuable assets here, in this house, protected from the greed and foolishness of the outside world. Inside the safe, you will find what remains of our fortune: bearer bonds, gold, coins, investments that have grown untouched for nearly a century. The combination is simple. The date of our wedding, August 14th, 1909, 81409. Use this gift wisely, use it with love, and remember, you were chosen not because of who you are, but because of who you can become. With hope for your future, Colleen Ashford. Harold read the letter twice, 3 times, struggling to process the words. Then he handed it to Ruth. She read it in silence, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. When she finished, she looked at Harold. "The combination," she whispered. "She gave us the combination." They approached the safe together. Harold's hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the dial. Ruth placed her hands over his, steadying them. "Together," she said. He nodded. Slowly, carefully, he turned the dial. 81409. There was a sound like a heartbeat, a deep mechanical thunk from somewhere inside the steel. Then the handle turned and the door swung open. The first thing they saw was gold. Bars of it, stacked neatly on shelves, gleaming even in the dim light of the attic. There must have been 50 bars, maybe more, each one the size of a brick. Beside the gold were coins, American eagles, Krugerrands, rare pieces from the 1800s. They filled wooden boxes, hundreds of them, thousands. And behind the coins were bonds, bearer bonds, printed on paper so thick it felt like cloth. Harold pulled one out and stared at the number printed on its face. $100,000. Face value. There were stacks of them, dozens of stacks. Ruth sank to her knees, her legs unable to support her. "Harold, how much is this?" He moved through the safe methodically, counting, calculating, his engineer's brain working overtime. The gold alone was worth millions at current prices. The coins were rare, collectible, some of them worth 50 times their weight. And the bonds, bearer bonds, appreciated in value. Ones issued in the early 20th century, held for nearly 100 years. He found a ledger at the back of the safe, handwritten in careful script. The final entry was dated June 3, 1952, just a few months before Edward Ashford's death. "Total estimated value," he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. "Adjusted for growth and appreciation at conservative rates, $265 million. The number hung in the air like something impossible. Ruth pressed her hands to her face, sobbing. "That can't be right! That can't be real!" Harold sat down beside her, his own eyes wet. He pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "It's real," he said, his voice breaking. "All of it. It's real." For a long time, they simply sat there, holding each other in the dusty attic of a forgotten mansion, surrounded by more wealth than they could have imagined in 1,000 lifetimes. 5 days ago, they had been thrown out of their son's house with nothing but a suitcase and a prayer. 4 days ago, they had spent Christmas Eve in a motel room, wondering if they would survive the week. 3 days ago, they had driven through a blizzard with $23 to their name. And now they were sitting in front of $265 million, left to them by a woman Ruth had met only once, 65 years ago. Ruth pulled back and looked at Harold, her face streaked with tears. "What do we do? What do we do with all of this?" Harold thought about their son Derek, who had called them a burden. He thought about the grandchildren they might never see again. He thought about all the years of struggle, all the nights of worry, all the times they had given and given and given until there was nothing left. And then he thought about Colleen Ashford, waiting alone in this house for 70 years, trusting that the right person would come. "We honor it," he said finally. "We use it the way Edward wanted, the way Colleen wanted. We use it to help people." Ruth nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. People like us. People who've been thrown away, people who've been forgotten, people who deserve a second chance. She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and silent, blanketing the world in white. "Do you think she knew?" Ruth whispered. "Do you think Colleen knew what we'd been through, what we needed?" Harold looked around the attic, at the boxes of memories, the filing cabinets of history, the safe that held a fortune and a future. "I think she trusted," he said. "She trusted that whoever found this would understand, would appreciate it, would use it for good." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then she lifted her head and met his eyes. "Then that's what we'll do," she said. "We'll prove her right." They sat together in the attic until the light faded from the windows, two elderly people wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by wealth they had never sought and barely understood. But more than the gold, more than the bonds, more than the $265 million, they had something else. They had each other. They had purpose, and they had hope. And for Harold and Ruth, that was worth more than all the treasure in the world. The night settled over the mansion like a blessing. Harold helped Ruth down the hidden staircase, both of them moving slowly, their bodies exhausted, but their spirits strangely light. They didn't speak much. There was too much to process, too much to feel. Back in the library, Harold closed the hidden door carefully, watching the bookshelf swing back into place. The lever clicked softly, and just like that, the greatest secret of the Ashford mansion was sealed away again. "We should sleep," Ruth said, her voice hoarse from crying. "Really sleep, in a real bed." Harold nodded. "Colleen's room. It feels right." They climbed the grand staircase together, pausing at the landing to look back at the foyer below. The chandelier caught the last rays of moonlight filtering through the windows, casting tiny rainbows across the marble floor. "I keep expecting to wake up," Ruth admitted. "Me too," Harold said. "But I don't want to. Not from this dream." Colleen's bedroom was cold but not uncomfortable. They found extra blankets in a cedar chest and piled them high on the narrow bed. Ruth changed into her nightgown, the same one she'd worn in the motel, the only one she had, while Harold removed his shoes and jacket but kept his clothes on. Old habits. They lay together in the darkness, listening to the old house settle around them. "Harold?" Ruth's voice was small in the vast silence. "Yes? I'm scared." He turned to face her, even though he could barely see her outline in the dark. "Scared of what?" "Of what comes next, of making mistakes, of—" She paused. "Of losing this too." Harold reached for her hand and held it tight. "We've lost a lot in our lives, our savings, our health, our family." His voice caught on that last word. "But we've never lost each other, and we won't lose this." "How can you be sure?" He was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Because Colleen waited 70 years for the right person. She could have given it to anyone, charities, museums, strangers. But she chose you. She saw something in a 6-year-old girl with a kind heart, and she remembered it for 65 years. That's not random. That's not luck. That's providence." Ruth squeezed his hand. "I love you, Harold Whitmore. I love you too, Ruth Whitmore. More today than the day I married you." They fell asleep holding hands, like they had on their wedding night 52 years ago, and for the first time in months, neither of them dreamed of fear or failure or abandonment. They dreamed of possibility. The morning sun brought clarity. They woke early, stiff and sore but clear-headed, and began making plans. "We need to contact the attorney," Harold said over a breakfast of canned peaches and stale crackers. "Let him know we made it, and we need to understand what we're dealing with. Taxes, legal requirements, all of that." Ruth nodded. "And we need supplies. Real food, firewood, cleaning supplies. This house needs care. The town's not far. Maybe someone there can help." It was Ruth who remembered the detail that would change their approach. "Harold, those bearer bonds, the attorney should know about them. They're not like regular investments. They're practically anonymous. We need guidance before we do anything." Harold agreed. Financial matters had never been his strength. Machines, he understood. Money was a different kind of engine entirely. By mid-morning, they had bundled themselves into the old truck and made the slow drive into Colton. The roads had been ploughed, and the town, though small, was charming in a way that reminded Ruth of Christmas cards from her childhood. White church steeple, brick storefronts, a diner with steam rising from its windows. They parked on Main Street and walked into the diner together. Conversation stopped when they entered. In a town this small, strangers stood out. A woman behind the counter, 60-ish, with silver hair and kind eyes, smiled at them. "You folks lost?" "Not anymore," Harold said. "We just moved into the Ashford place, out on Hartwell Road." The woman's eyes widened. "The Ashford mansion? That's been empty for years, decades even." "Not anymore," Ruth said softly. The diner erupted in whispers. The woman, her name tag read Gladys, came around the counter and took Ruth's hands in hers. "Well, welcome to Colton," she said warmly. Sit down. First breakfast's on the house." Over eggs and coffee, Harold and Ruth learned about their new home. Colleen Ashford had been a legend in Colton, the mysterious widow who never left her house, who had groceries delivered but never answered the door, who had outlived everyone who remembered her husband. "Folks used to say she was crazy," Gladys admitted, "sitting alone in that big house, talking to herself. But I always thought she was just waiting for something or someone." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. She was waiting for us. That afternoon, they visited the small bank in town, where they opened a modest checking account with the last of their cash. The banker, a young man named Timothy, helped them set up automatic payments for utilities and connected them with local services for heating oil and firewood. They didn't mention the safe. Not yet. On the drive home, Harold made a decision. "We need to be careful. $265 million. That kind of money attracts attention, good and bad." Ruth nodded. "We should keep living simply, at least for now, until we understand what we're doing." "Agreed. And we should find people we can trust. Lawyers, accountants, people who can help us do this right." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I keep thinking about Derek, about the grandchildren." Harold's jaw tightened. "What about them?" "They're still our family, even after everything. I'm not saying we forgive him. I'm not sure I can. But Emma and Marcus, they didn't choose this. They didn't throw us out." Harold stared at the road ahead. "You want to reach out?" "Not yet, but someday, maybe." He didn't respond, but Ruth could see his hands relax on the steering wheel just slightly. Some wounds took time to heal, but the first step was acknowledging they existed. That night, back in the mansion, they climbed the hidden staircase one more time. Harold wanted another look at the documents, the patents, the records, the history of everything Edward Ashford had built. While he examined the filing cabinets, Ruth sat on an old trunk and began looking through a box of photographs. Most showed people she didn't recognize: factory workers, business partners, formal portraits from another era. But at the bottom of the box she found something that made her gasp. A photograph of a young woman, maybe 20 years old, with dark hair and bright eyes. She was sitting in a garden, laughing at something off camera, a silver locket around her neck. Ruth recognized that locket. She was wearing it right now, tucked beneath her sweater. "Harold," she breathed. "This is her. This is Colleen, when she was young." He came to look, kneeling beside her. She was beautiful. "She looks happy." Ruth touched the photograph gently. She had her whole life ahead of her. They sat together in silence, staring at the face of the woman who had trusted them with everything she had. "We have to do this right," Ruth said finally. "For her, for Edward, for everyone who came before." Harold nodded. "We will. I promise you, we will." They descended from the attic as the last light faded from the windows. The mansion was quiet around them, but it no longer felt empty. It felt alive somehow, as if the house itself had been waiting for them all along. Ruth paused at the bottom of the hidden staircase and looked back up into the darkness. "Thank you, Aunt Colleen," she whispered. "We won't let you down." and somewhere in the old walls, in the creak of settling boards and the sigh of winter wind, she could have sworn she heard an answer. Harold closed the bookshelf door and took his wife's hand. "Ready?" he asked. She looked at him, this man she had loved for more than half a century, who had never once let her down, who had driven through a blizzard to give her a second chance. "Ready," she said, and together, hand in hand, they walked into their new life. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Harold and Ruth had ever experienced. They moved through their days slowly, carefully, like people learning to walk again after a long illness. The mansion required constant attention, frozen pipes, drafty windows, rooms that hadn't been aired out in decades, but the work felt good, purposeful. Each repair was a small victory, each cleaned room a reclaimed piece of their new life. Harold threw himself into the practical tasks with the same determination he'd brought to every job he'd ever held. He fixed the plumbing in the downstairs bathroom, replaced rotted boards on the back porch, and spent 3 days cleaning and servicing the ancient furnace until it ran as smooth as the day it was installed. His body ached every night, but it was the good kind of ache, the kind that came from building something instead of losing it. Ruth focused on the interior. She washed curtains that had hung untouched for 40 years, beat dust from rugs that had witnessed a century of footsteps, and polished silver that had tarnished black with neglect. She found joy in the smallest things, a window that sparkled in the morning light, a mantelpiece cleared of cobwebs, a vase of dried flowers that still held a faint scent of lavender. They worked in silence mostly, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the quiet understanding of two people who had spent 52 years learning each other's rhythms. Sometimes Ruth would hum an old hymn and Harold would join in, his voice rough but steady. Sometimes they would stop what they were doing and simply hold each other, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had happened to them. The attorney, Franklin Pierce, arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 2 weeks after their initial phone call. He was younger than Harold expected, mid-40s with wire-rimmed glasses and a serious demeanor that softened when he shook Ruth's hand. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said warmly, "it's an honor to finally meet you in person." They sat in the parlor, which Ruth had cleaned just the day before. A fire crackled in the hearth, and weak winter sunlight filtered through the tall windows. Franklin spread his papers across the coffee table and began to explain. "The estate is substantial," he said, which struck Harold as perhaps the understatement of the century. "But it's also complicated. The assets have been held in trust for nearly 70 years, accumulating value but also accumulating complexity." "What does that mean for us?" Harold asked. Franklin adjusted his glasses. "It means we need to be very careful. The bearer bonds, in particular, present unique challenges. They're essentially untraceable. Whoever holds them owns them. That was intentional on Mr. Ashford's part. He didn't trust banks after the crash of '29. Ruth nodded. "We read his letters. He was afraid of losing everything again. And his caution paid off. The bonds have appreciated enormously over the past century. Conservatively, we're looking at somewhere between $250 and $270 million in total assets. The number still didn't feel real. Harold heard it, understood it intellectually, but couldn't make it fit inside his brain. $265 million. More money than he could have earned in 1,000 lifetimes of factory work. "There are tax implications, of course," Franklin continued. "Inheritance taxes, capital gains when you liquidate assets, ongoing property taxes. I've already begun working with a team of specialists, accountants, tax attorneys, estate planners. They'll help us navigate the process." "Can we trust them?" Ruth asked quietly. Franklin met her eyes. "I've worked with these people for 20 years. They're discreet, professional, and loyal. But more importantly, Colleen Ashford vetted them herself. She updated her estate plan every 5 years, right up until her death. She chose these people specifically because she believed they would serve her heir well, Ruth's eyes welled with tears. She thought of everything. She did. Franklin paused, then added gently, "She also included certain provisions that you should know about." "What kind of provisions?" Harold asked. Franklin pulled out a document and handed it to them. "This is what's called a no-contest clause. It states that if any family member challenges the will or attempts to claim a portion of the estate through legal action, the entire inheritance reverts to a charitable trust." Harold frowned. Why would she include something like that? "Because she knew human nature," Franklin said. "She had no children of her own, but she had distant relatives, people who came out of the woodwork over the years, claiming connections, asking for money. She refused them all, and she wanted to make sure that whoever inherited her estate wouldn't be harassed by opportunists." Ruth and Harold exchanged glances. They hadn't told anyone about Derek, hadn't mentioned that their own son had thrown them out just weeks before, but somehow it felt like Colleen had known, had anticipated. "The clause is ironclad," Franklin continued. "I helped draft it myself. Anyone who contests this will get nothing, and neither does the intended heir. Everything goes to charity." "That seems harsh," Ruth said. "It's protective," Franklin corrected gently. "Colleen wanted to make sure you could enjoy this gift without interference, without guilt, without pressure." After Franklin left, Harold and Ruth sat in the parlor for a long time, watching the fire burn down to embers. "She protected us," Ruth said finally. "A woman I met once, 65 years ago. She protected us from people she never even knew." Harold nodded. "She must have seen something in you, something worth protecting." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you think Derek will find out?" Harold's jaw tightened. "Probably. Word travels. And when it does—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The call came 3 weeks later. Harold was in the basement, working on a stuck valve in the water heater, when Ruth's voice drifted down the stairs. "Harold, Harold, you need to come up here." Something in her tone made his stomach drop. He wiped his hands on a rag and climbed the stairs as quickly as his old knees would allow. Ruth stood in the foyer, the telephone pressed to her ear, her face pale. "Yes," she was saying. "Yes, I understand. We'll discuss it." She hung up slowly, like the receiver weighed 100 pounds. "Who was that?" Harold asked. Ruth looked at him, and he saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen in 50 years of marriage. Not fear, not sadness, anger. "That was Derek," she said quietly. "He's coming here, tomorrow." Harold felt his blood pressure spike. "How did he find us?" "He didn't say, but he knows about the inheritance. He called it the fortune, said he wants to talk about the family's future." "The family's future," Harold's voice rose. "He threw us out on Christmas Eve. He called us a burden, and now he wants to talk about family." Ruth set down the phone and straightened her shoulders. "He's bringing Vanessa and a lawyer." "A lawyer?" "That's what he said." Harold paced the foyer, his boots echoing on the marble floor. His mind raced through possibilities: legal challenges, custody claims, accusations. He thought about the no-contest clause Franklin had shown them. If Derek tried to fight the will— "We need to call Franklin," he said, "right now." Franklin arrived that evening, accompanied by a woman he introduced as Margaret Chen, a litigation specialist. "This is exactly what the no-contest clause was designed to prevent," Margaret explained, spreading documents across the dining room table. "If your son attempts to challenge the will or claim any portion of the estate, the clause triggers automatically. Everything goes to the Ashford Charitable Trust." "But he's not challenging the will," Ruth said. "He just wants to talk." Margaret's expression was skeptical. "In my experience, when estranged family members show up with lawyers after learning about an inheritance, they're not interested in conversation. They're interested in leverage." Harold rubbed his temples. "What should we do?" Let them come, Franklin said. Hear what they have to say. Don't agree to anything. Don't sign anything. Don't make any promises. We'll be here with you. Ruth nodded slowly. I need to face him. I need to say what I should have said that night. Harold looked at his wife, this woman who had spent her entire life avoiding conflict, smoothing over disagreements, keeping the peace at any cost. Something had changed in her. Something had hardened. Okay, he said. We'll face him together. The next afternoon, a black SUV pulled up the long driveway and parked in front of the mansion. Harold and Ruth watched from the parlor window as 3 figures emerged, Derek, Vanessa, and a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. Here we go, Harold muttered. They met at the front door. Ruth opened it before Derek could knock, standing tall in the doorway, blocking the entrance. Derek, she said. Her voice was steady, but Harold could see her hands trembling at her sides. Mom. Derek smiled. That same smile he'd used as a boy when he wanted something, when he was trying to charm his way out of trouble. You look good. The country air agrees with you. Ruth didn't smile back. Why are you here? Derek's smile faltered. Can we come in? It's cold out here. I asked you a question. Vanessa stepped forward, her voice dripping with practiced sweetness. Ruth, please, we drove all this way. We just want to talk, as a family. Ruth stood motionless for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. Fine, talk. They gathered in the parlor, Derek and Vanessa on one sofa, their lawyer in a chair beside them. Harold and Ruth sat across from them, with Franklin and Margaret standing near the fireplace like sentinels. This is quite a place, Derek said, looking around with barely concealed greed. Must have cost a fortune. It's been in my family for 5 generations, Ruth said quietly. Your great-great-aunt's family, actually, though I don't suppose you ever cared about family history. Derek's jaw tightened. Look, Mom, I know things ended badly between us. Badly? Harold's voice cut through the room like a blade. You threw us out on Christmas Eve. You gave us 20 minutes to pack our lives into suitcases. You called us a burden and left us at a roadside motel. We were under a lot of stress, Vanessa interjected. The move, the kids, the finances. We gave you our social security checks, Ruth said. Every month for 3 years. We raised your children while you worked. We did everything you asked, and you threw us away like garbage. The room fell silent. Derek shifted uncomfortably. We made a mistake, he said finally. A terrible mistake, and we're sorry, truly. Ruth's eyes never wavered. No, you're not. You're here because you found out about the money. That's all you've ever cared about. Derek's lawyer cleared his throat. Perhaps we could discuss the matter at hand. My client believes there may be grounds for a family settlement arrangement. There are no grounds, Margaret interrupted sharply. The will is clear. Mrs. Whitmore is the sole heir. Any attempt to challenge that will trigger a no-contest clause that transfers everything to charity. The lawyer's face paled. I wasn't aware. Then you should have done your research before dragging your clients 800 miles on a fool's errand. Derek's composure finally cracked. He leaned forward, his voice low and angry. You can't cut us out. We're your family. We have rights. You have nothing, Ruth said, and her voice was ice. You gave up your rights the moment you put us out in the cold. What happens next will turn this moment into a reckoning, reveal the true strength of a woman who spent her life being quiet, and show that sometimes the greatest power comes from those who were underestimated. Stay tuned for what unfolds. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Derek shot to his feet. This is ridiculous. She's an old woman. She's not mentally competent to handle this kind of money. I'll take this to court, and you'll lose everything, Franklin said calmly. For yourself and for your parents. The moment you file a challenge, the inheritance reverts to charity. Your mother gets nothing. You get nothing. Is that what you want? Derek's face went red. You can't do this. You can't just... Sit down. Ruth's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of 50 years of patience finally exhausted. Sit down and listen. Something in her tone made Derek obey. He sank back onto the sofa, his bluster deflating. Ruth stood slowly, her small frame somehow filling the room. She looked at her son, this man she had raised, fed, clothed, loved, and saw him clearly for the first time. I spent my whole life trying to keep the peace, she said. I smoothed over your father's arguments with you. I made excuses for your selfishness. I convinced myself that you would grow out of it, that somewhere inside you was the sweet boy I used to rock to sleep. Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. But that boy is gone. Maybe he was never there, and I can't keep pretending anymore. Vanessa started to speak, but Ruth silenced her with a look. You came here expecting a weak-old woman you could manipulate, someone who would feel guilty, who would hand over money just to buy your love. But I'm done buying your love, Derek. I'm done earning my place in your life. She gestured at the mansion around them. This house was left to me by a woman who met me once, 65 years ago. A stranger who saw something in me worth remembering. And she gave me more kindness in death than my own son gave me in life. Derek's face contorted. Mom, that's not fair. Fair? Ruth's voice rose, surprising everyone, including herself. You want to talk about fair? I changed your diapers. I worked double shifts so you could go to college. I gave you the down payment for your first house. And when Harold and I needed help, when we had nothing left, you looked us in the eye and told us we were too much trouble. Tears streamed down her cheeks now, but her voice remained steady. I forgive you, Derek, not because you deserve it, but because carrying this anger will only poison whatever years I have left. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean giving you a single penny of this inheritance. The room was silent. Even Vanessa had stopped trying to interrupt. Derek stared at his mother like he was seeing her for the first time. You've changed, he said finally. No, Ruth replied. I finally stopped hiding who I've always been. The lawyer gathered his papers with shaking hands. I think we're done here. Derek stood slowly, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, anger, shame, something that might have been regret. He looked at his father. Dad, you're really going to let her do this? Harold rose to stand beside his wife. He took her hand in his. Your mother has never been more right about anything in her life, he said. Now get out of our house. Derek's mouth opened and closed. For a moment, he looked like the lost little boy Ruth remembered, confused, hurt, reaching for something he couldn't quite grasp. Then the moment passed. His face hardened, and he turned without another word. Vanessa followed, then the lawyer. The front door slammed behind them. Ruth's legs gave out. Harold caught her, guided her to the sofa, held her as she sobbed. I did it, she whispered. I finally did it. You were magnificent, Harold said, his own eyes wet. Absolutely magnificent. Franklin and Margaret quietly gathered their things and slipped out, giving the elderly couple privacy. Outside, the sound of the SUV's engine faded down the driveway and disappeared. For a long time, Harold and Ruth simply sat together in the silence of the old mansion. The fire crackled softly. The winter light began to fade. Do you think we'll ever see the grandchildren again? Ruth asked finally. Harold was quiet for a moment. I don't know. Maybe someday, when they're older, when they can make their own choices. I miss them, Emma and Marcus. They didn't do anything wrong. No, they didn't. And maybe... Harold paused, choosing his words carefully. Maybe we can find a way to be part of their lives without going through Derek. Set up trusts for their education. Make sure they have opportunities. Ruth nodded slowly. Colleen would have liked that, using the money to help innocent children. She would have. They sat in silence a while longer. Then Ruth stood, wiping her eyes. I'm going to make tea, she said. Would you like some? I'd love some. She walked toward the kitchen, pausing at the doorway to look back at him. Harold? Yes? Thank you for standing with me. He smiled, a real smile, the first in what felt like forever. Always, Ruth, always. News of the confrontation spread through Colton faster than Harold would have thought possible. Within a week, everyone in town seemed to know that the elderly couple at the Ashford mansion had faced down their estranged son and sent him packing. What surprised them both was the response. It started with Gladys from the diner. She showed up one morning with a casserole dish and a determined expression. "Heard you folks had some trouble," she said, pushing past Harold into the foyer. "Brought you my famous chicken pot pie. You need to eat." Before Ruth could protest, Gladys had installed herself in the kitchen, heating the casserole and making coffee like she owned the place. She stayed for 2 hours, telling stories about the town's history, about Colleen Ashford's reclusiveness, about the way gossip traveled at the speed of light in small communities. "Everyone's talking about what you did," she said. "Standing up to your own son like that. Folks here respect that." "We didn't want attention," Ruth said quietly. Gladys patted her hand. "Honey, you're living in the Ashford mansion with more money than God. Attention's going to find you whether you want it or not. The question is what you do with it." The next day, a man named Walter showed up with a truckload of firewood. He refused payment, saying only, "My grandfather used to do maintenance work for Mrs. Ashford. She was good to him. Figured I'd return the favor." Then came a group of women from the local church, bearing casseroles and quilts and offers to help with cleaning. A retired plumber volunteered to check the pipes. A young couple offered to clear the snow from the long driveway. Harold and Ruth accepted each kindness with bewildered gratitude. They had spent so long being invisible, ignored by their own family, overlooked by the world, that this outpouring of warmth felt almost overwhelming. "Why are they doing this?" Ruth asked one evening, looking out at the pile of firewood that now reached the eaves of the back porch. "They don't know us." Harold considered the question. Maybe that's exactly why. We're strangers who showed up with nothing and refused to be beaten down. People respect that. They see themselves in us. Ruth turned the thought over in her mind. Gladys said something today. She said the town's been dying for years. Young people leaving, businesses closing. She said we're the most exciting thing to happen here in decades. That's a lot of pressure. It is, Ruth paused. But maybe it's also an opportunity. Harold looked at her. "What are you thinking?" Ruth walked to the window and gazed out at the snow-covered grounds. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "Colleen waited 70 years for the right person to inherit all this," she said slowly. "Not because she wanted us to hoard it. Not because she wanted us to live in luxury while the world around us struggled." "You think she wanted us to share it?" Ruth turned to face him. "I think she wanted us to do what Edward always intended, to use this wealth for good, to help people who've been forgotten." Harold was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "What did you have in mind?" Ruth's eyes lit up in a way Harold hadn't seen since they were young, since they were building a life together from nothing. "The town needs jobs. It needs hope. It needs a reason for young people to stay instead of leaving." She gestured at the mansion around them. "We have resources. We have this enormous house. We have land. What if we used it to build something?" "Build what?" "I don't know yet. Something that helps people like us. People who've been thrown away. People who deserve a second chance." Harold walked to stand beside her at the window. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear. "That's a big dream," he said. "We have big resources." Ruth smiled faintly. "And we have each other." He took her hand. "Then let's do it. Let's build something worth leaving behind." That night, Ruth couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with possibilities, ideas half-formed, visions of what could be. She slipped out of bed and climbed the hidden staircase to the attic, to the vault that held everything. The safe stood open now, its contents catalogued and organized by Franklin's team. But it wasn't the gold or the bonds that drew her tonight. It was the photographs. She sat on the old trunk and looked through them again. Edward and Colleen on their wedding day, young and hopeful. Edward in his workshop, surrounded by inventions. Colleen in the garden, laughing at something off camera. At the bottom of the box, she found the photograph of young Colleen with the locket, her locket, the one Ruth still wore around her neck. "You knew," Ruth whispered to the photograph. "Somehow you knew this day would come." She sat in silence for a long time, watching the moonlight filter through the attic window. $265 million. Enough to change countless lives. Enough to build a legacy that would outlast them all. Ruth looked out at the snow-covered grounds, at the small town visible in the distance, at the world waiting to be helped. "Maybe this money wasn't meant to save us," she said softly. "Maybe it was meant to save others." She stood slowly, tucked the photograph into her pocket, and descended the hidden staircase. Tomorrow, she would tell Harold her ideas. Tomorrow, they would start planning. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. But tonight, she was content simply to dream, to imagine, to believe that even at 71 years old, thrown away by her own son, her life could still mean something. She climbed back into bed beside Harold, who stirred and reached for her hand. "You okay?" he mumbled sleepily. "I'm better than okay," she whispered. "I'm ready." He squeezed her hand and drifted back to sleep. Ruth lay awake a while longer, listening to the old house settle around them, feeling the weight of possibility pressing against her chest. This wasn't the end of their story. It wasn't even the middle. It was only the beginning. The first day of spring arrived in Colton with a warmth that felt like forgiveness. The snow that had blanketed the hills for months began to melt, revealing patches of brown earth and the first tentative shoots of green. Streams ran swollen with snowmelt, and the air carried that particular freshness that comes only after a long winter. Harold stood on the front porch of the Ashford mansion, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. 3 months had passed since they'd arrived in the middle of a blizzard with nothing but a suitcase and a prayer. 3 months since they'd discovered the fortune hidden in the attic. 3 months since they'd sent Derek away empty-handed. It felt like a lifetime. Behind him, the front door opened and Ruth stepped out, wrapped in a cardigan she'd found in one of Colleen's closets. She'd taken to wearing the old woman's clothes, not out of necessity, but out of respect, a way of keeping Colleen's memory close. "You're up early," she said, joining him at the railing. "Couldn't sleep, too many ideas bouncing around in my head." Ruth smiled. "Tell me." Harold turned to face her, his eyes bright with something she hadn't seen in years. Excitement. Purpose. "I've been thinking about what you said, about using this money to help people, about building something that matters." He set down his coffee and pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "I made a list." Ruth unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was Harold's, neat, precise, the penmanship of a man who'd spent decades filling out work orders and maintenance logs. "Emergency housing for seniors," she read aloud. "Legal aid for elderly abuse victims, job training programs, community kitchen, after-school programs for children." She looked up at him. "Harold, this is wonderful." "It's just the start, but I keep coming back to one central idea." He pointed to the mansion behind them. "This house, it's too big for 2 people. It was too big for Colleen living here alone all those years. But what if it wasn't just our home? What if it was everyone's?" Ruth's breath caught. "You want to open the mansion?" "Not to tourists, to people who need it. A community center, a refuge, a place where no one gets turned away, no matter who they are or what they've been through." Ruth was quiet for a long moment, turning the idea over in her mind. She thought about the night they'd spent in that motel room, cold and afraid and alone. She thought about the families she'd seen at the diner, struggling, barely holding on, one crisis away from losing everything. "Colleen would have loved this," she said finally. Harold nodded. "I think she was hoping for exactly this. All those years she spent alone, waiting. She wasn't just waiting for an heir. She was waiting for someone who would understand what the money was really for." Ruth took his hand. "Then let's do it. Let's build something worth leaving behind." The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Harold and Ruth worked with Franklin and a team of specialists to establish what they called the Second Chance Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping elderly people who had been abandoned, abused, or forgotten by their families. The legal paperwork alone took weeks. There were tax implications to navigate, organizational structures to establish, boards to assemble. Ruth spent hours on the phone with lawyers and accountants, her notepad filled with terms she'd never heard before: 501c3 status, endowment funds, grant applications. But she learned. They both did. And slowly, piece by piece, the foundation took shape. The first project was the mansion itself. Harold hired local contractors to renovate the East Wing, converting it into a residential facility with 12 private rooms, each with its own bathroom and sitting area. The work took 4 months and employed more than 30 people from Colton and the surrounding towns. "First time I've had steady work in 2 years," one of the carpenters told Ruth one afternoon. His name was Michael, a father of 3 whose construction company had gone under during the recession. "You folks are doing something special here." Ruth squeezed his arm. "We're just getting started." While the renovation progressed, Ruth focused on the human side of things. She reached out to social services agencies across Vermont, letting them know about the foundation's mission. She contacted churches, community centers, hospitals, anywhere that might encounter elderly people in crisis. The response was overwhelming. "You wouldn't believe the calls we're getting," she told Harold one evening, her voice heavy with emotion. "A woman in Burlington whose children put her in a nursing home and never visited. A man in Rutland whose family took his pension and left him on the street. Stories just like ours, Harold. Dozens of them." Harold put his arm around her. "Then we'll help as many as we can." The Second Chance Residence, as they officially named it, opened its doors on June 15th. The first resident was a 78-year-old woman named Margaret, whose daughter had stolen her savings and disappeared, leaving her unable to pay rent. She arrived with a single suitcase, just as Harold and Ruth had arrived months before. Ruth greeted her at the door personally. "Welcome home, Margaret," she said, and meant every word. Within a month, all 12 rooms were full. The waiting list grew longer by the day, but the residence was only the beginning. Harold had bigger plans for the property, plans that would transform not just the mansion, but the entire town of Colton. "We have 40 acres here," he explained to the town council at a meeting in July. "Most of it's been unused for decades. But the soil is good, the water's clean. With the right investment, we could turn this land into something that benefits everyone." The council members exchanged skeptical glances. They'd heard promises before from developers, politicians, dreamers who blew through town and left nothing behind but disappointment. "What exactly are you proposing?" asked the mayor, a heavy-set man named Gerald, who'd held the position for 15 years. Harold unrolled a set of blueprints across the table. "A community farm, organic vegetables, fruit orchards, maybe some livestock eventually. We'd employ local workers, train young people in sustainable agriculture, and donate a portion of the harvest to food banks across the region." "That's a lot of money," Gerald said slowly. "We have a lot of money," Ruth replied simply, "and we'd rather spend it here helping our neighbors than watch it sit in a vault collecting dust." The vote was unanimous. The Ashford Community Farm broke ground in August. The first harvest came in October. Bushels of squash, carrots, potatoes, and apples. They held a festival to celebrate, with the entire town invited. Families spread blankets on the lawn of the mansion. Children ran through the orchards playing tag, and for the first time in years, Colton felt alive. Gladys from the diner set up a booth selling apple cider and pie. Walter, who'd delivered that first load of firewood, manned the hayride. Even old man Jenkins, who hadn't left his house in 3 years, came out to sit in the sunshine and watch the children play. Harold and Ruth stood on the porch, taking it all in. "Look at them," Ruth whispered, her eyes bright with tears. "All these people, all this joy. And to think, 6 months ago we were sleeping in a motel room wondering if we'd survive the week." Harold pulled her close. Colleen knew. Somehow she knew this was what we'd do with her gift. Maybe that's why she waited so long, waited for the right people. Or maybe, Harold said thoughtfully, she created the right people by giving us the chance to become who we were always meant to be. The months that followed brought more growth, more change, more hope. The foundation expanded its programs, adding legal aid services for elderly abuse victims, a job training program for displaced workers over 50, and a community kitchen that served hot meals to anyone who needed them. The mansion itself became the heart of Colton's social life. Town meetings were held in the Great Hall. The library hosted book clubs and reading programs for children. The music room, its grand piano now fully restored, became a venue for concerts and recitals. Harold and Ruth moved into the caretaker's cottage behind the main house, leaving the mansion for community use. It was a small space, cozy and warm, with a view of the orchards and the hills beyond. It reminded Ruth of the apartment they'd shared when they were first married, back when love was enough, when the future stretched out endless and bright. "We've come full circle," she said one evening, watching the sunset from their tiny porch. Harold nodded. "But this time, we're not alone." As the foundation grew, so did Harold and Ruth's role in the community. They became, without quite meaning to, surrogate grandparents to dozens of children whose own families were scattered or struggling. There was Emma, an 8-year-old whose mother worked 3 jobs and couldn't afford after-school care. Ruth picked her up from school every day and helped her with homework at the kitchen table, just as she'd done with her own grandchildren years ago. There was Marcus, a shy teenager who'd been bouncing between foster homes since he was 12. Harold taught him how to change oil, repair engines, and fix things with his hands, skills no one had ever bothered to teach him before. There was little Sarah, just 4 years old, whose grandmother was one of the residents at Second Chance. She followed Ruth everywhere, clutching a stuffed rabbit and asking endless questions about everything. "Why is the sky blue? Why do birds sing? Why do you have wrinkles?" Ruth would answer each question patiently, marveling at the curiosity of childhood, at the way small hands reached up so trustingly for hers. "You're good with children," Margaret observed one afternoon, watching Ruth read a story to Sarah and 3 other little ones gathered at her feet. Ruth smiled. "I had practice. I raised one of my own, helped raise 2 grandchildren." "Do you ever see them? Your grandchildren?" The question hung in the air. Ruth's smile faded slightly. "No," she said quietly. "Not anymore." Margaret nodded slowly. "They're lost. They have no idea what they're missing." The winter of that year was milder than the one before, but it still brought challenges. The heating system in the East Wing needed repairs. A pipe burst in the community kitchen. 2 of the residents came down with the flu, and Ruth spent a week nursing them back to health. But even in the hardest moments, there was joy. There was connection. There was the knowledge that they were building something that would outlast them. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after Derek had thrown them out, Harold and Ruth hosted a dinner at the mansion for all the residents, staff, and volunteers. More than 60 people gathered in the Great Hall, seated at long tables decorated with pine boughs and candles. Ruth stood at the head of the table, looking out at the faces before her, old and young, rich and poor, people who had become family in the truest sense of the word. "1 year ago tonight," she began, her voice trembling slightly. Harold and I were alone in a motel room, wondering if we would survive the week. Our own son had told us we were too much of a burden. We had nothing, no money, no home, no hope. The room was silent. Even the children had stopped fidgeting. But then something miraculous happened. We inherited this house, this fortune, this second chance, not because we deserved it, but because someone believed in us. Someone saw something in us that we couldn't see in ourselves. She paused, gathering her emotions. Colleen Ashford waited 70 years to give this gift. I used to wonder why. Why wait so long? Why not enjoy the money herself or give it to charity while she was still alive? Ruth looked around the room at the people she had come to love. Now I understand. She was waiting for the right moment, the right people. She was waiting for all of us. Harold rose to stand beside her, taking her hand. "This past year has been the most meaningful of our lives," he said. "Not because of the money, but because of what the money let us do. It let us build community. It let us help people who had been forgotten. It let us become who we were always meant to be." He raised his glass. "To Colleen Ashford, to Second Chances, and to all of you, our family." The room erupted in cheers and applause. Glasses clinked, children laughed. And in that moment, surrounded by warmth and love, Harold and Ruth knew they had found something more precious than any fortune. They had found their purpose. The spring brought new growth, new programs, new faces. The foundation hired its 50th employee. The community farm expanded to include a greenhouse for year-round production. The Second Chance residents opened a second wing, doubling its capacity. Ruth started a memoir writing program for the residents, helping them record their life stories for their families and future generations. Harold launched a repair clinic, teaching basic maintenance skills to anyone who wanted to learn. "You don't throw something away just because it's broken," he'd tell his students, holding up a toaster or a lamp or a child's bicycle. "You figure out what's wrong, and you fix it." That's true for machines. It's true for people, too. The local newspaper ran a feature story on the foundation, calling Harold and Ruth the guardian angels of Colton. The story was picked up by regional outlets, then national ones. Suddenly, donations were pouring in from across the country, people who had read about their work and wanted to help. "We got a check today from a woman in California," Ruth told Harold one evening, shaking her head in disbelief. $5,000. She said she read our story and it made her think about her own parents, how she hadn't called them in months. She said she picked up the phone that night and talked to her mother for 2 hours. Harold smiled. "That's worth more than the check." "I know. That's exactly what I was thinking." The foundation used the donations to expand its reach, partnering with organizations across Vermont and beyond. They funded similar programs in other towns, trained volunteers, shared their model with anyone who wanted to replicate it. "We're not building an empire," Ruth would explain to visitors who came to learn from their example. "We're planting seeds. The more people who do this work, the more lives we change." It was on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, 1 year and 4 months after they'd first arrived at the mansion, that Ruth received a phone call that changed everything. She was in the community kitchen, helping prepare dinner for that evening's meal service, when her cell phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something made her answer. "Hello?" There was a long pause, then a voice she hadn't heard in over a year. "Mom?" Ruth's hand tightened on the phone. Around her, the kitchen continued its busy rhythm, pots clanging, volunteers chatting, the smell of roasting vegetables filling the air. But for Ruth, time had stopped. "Derek." Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice was different than she remembered, smaller, broken. "I know I don't deserve to call. I know I have no right. But I didn't know who else." His voice cracked. "Mom, I need help." Ruth stepped out of the kitchen into the quiet hallway, her heart pounding. "What's happened?" The story came out in fragments, each piece more painful than the last. Vanessa had left him 6 months ago, taking the children and moving to her sister's place in North Carolina. The divorce had been brutal. She'd gotten the house, the savings, most of his retirement fund. He'd lost his job shortly after, unable to focus, unable to function. "I've been living in my car for the past 2 weeks," Derek said, his voice hollow. "I ran out of money. I ran out of options. I ran out of—" He trailed off. Ruth closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was her son, the boy she'd nursed through childhood illnesses, the teenager she'd defended against his father's strictness, the man who had looked her in the eye and called her a burden. "Where are you now?" she asked. "A rest stop outside of Burlington. I've been driving around for days, trying to figure out what to do. I finally worked up the courage to call." Courage? The word came out sharper than she intended. "It took courage to call your mother?" Silence on the other end. Ruth took a deep breath. "I'm sorry. That wasn't fair." "No," Derek said quietly. "It was completely fair. I deserve worse." Ruth leaned against the wall, feeling suddenly exhausted. A year of building, of healing, of learning to live without the family that had abandoned her. And now this. A phone call that threatened to undo everything. "What do you want from me, Derek?" "I don't know. I don't have any right to ask for anything. His voice broke again. "I just needed to hear your voice, to tell you I'm sorry, to say all the things I should have said a year ago." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Through the kitchen door she could hear the volunteers laughing, the clatter of dishes being prepared. Life going on, as it always did. "Where exactly is this rest stop?" she asked finally. She found Harold in his workshop behind the cottage, bent over a broken lawnmower engine. She told him about the call, watching his face shift through a dozen emotions: anger, disbelief, something that might have been satisfaction, and finally, reluctantly, compassion. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I don't know. Part of me wants to hang up and forget he ever called. After everything he did," she shook her head. "But another part of me, he's still your son." "Yes, he's still my son." Harold set down his wrench and wiped his hands on a rag. "The Second Chance Foundation. That's what we called it. Second chances for people who've been abandoned and forgotten." Ruth nodded slowly. "Seems hypocritical to offer that to strangers, but not to our own flesh and blood." "He hurt us, Harold. He threw us away." "He did, and it was wrong, unforgivable maybe." Harold paused. "But if we've learned anything this past year, it's that people can change, circumstances can change, and holding on to anger doesn't hurt anyone but ourselves." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached for his hand. "Will you come with me?" "Always." They drove to Burlington that afternoon, Ruth at the wheel while Harold navigated from a printed map. Neither of them spoke much. There wasn't much to say. The decision had been made, and now they had to follow through. The rest stop was nearly empty when they arrived, just a few trucks idling at the far end of the lot and a single car parked near the restrooms. It was Derek's car, a sedan that had seen better days, its back seat piled with clothes and boxes. Derek was sitting on a bench nearby, head in his hands. He looked up when he heard their car pull in, and Ruth barely recognized him. He'd lost weight, too much weight. His clothes were wrinkled, his face unshaven, his eyes hollow with exhaustion and something deeper, shame. Ruth got out of the car slowly, Harold beside her. They walked across the parking lot, gravel crunching under their feet, until they stood in front of the bench. Derek rose unsteadily. "Mom, Dad." His voice was barely a whisper. "You came." "We came," Ruth said. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of pine and distant rain. Then Derek's face crumpled. "I'm so sorry," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry for everything. For Christmas Eve, for the things I said, for not calling, for being so—" He couldn't finish. Ruth watched her son cry. This man who had once been a baby in her arms, a toddler taking his first steps, a teenager convinced he knew everything. She had loved him through all of it, even when he made it difficult, even when he broke her heart. She thought about Colleen Ashford, waiting 70 years to give away her fortune. She thought about the residents of Second Chance, finding dignity after years of despair. She thought about all the strangers who had shown her kindness when her own family had turned away. And she made her choice. Ruth stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her son. Derek collapsed against her, sobbing like a child. Harold stood nearby, his own eyes wet, watching as years of pain and resentment began to crack and crumble. "I forgive you," Ruth whispered into her son's ear. "I forgive you." They didn't give Derek money. That wasn't what he needed. And besides, the no contest clause still applied. Any significant gift could be seen as an inheritance challenge and jeopardize everything. But they gave him something more valuable. They gave him a job. Derek started work at the community farm in May, earning minimum wage like everyone else. He lived in a small apartment in town, paid for from his own wages, and showed up every morning at 6 to help with planting, harvesting, and everything in between. At first, the other workers were suspicious. They knew who he was, knew what he'd done. But Derek didn't complain, didn't ask for special treatment, didn't act like the son of the foundation's founders. He just worked, quietly and steadily, rebuilding his life one day at a time. "He's different," Gladys observed to Ruth one afternoon, watching Derek load boxes onto a truck. "Whatever happened to him, it changed something." Ruth nodded. "Sometimes you have to lose everything to find yourself." "Speaking from experience," Ruth smiled. "Always." The summer brought warmth and growth, not just in the gardens, but in relationships. Derek slowly earned the trust of his co-workers. He started attending community dinners at the mansion, sitting quietly at the edge of conversations, listening more than speaking. One evening, Ruth found him alone on the back porch, staring at the sunset. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. He shook his head, and she settled into the chair beside him. "I've been thinking about Dad," Derek said after a long silence, "about how I never really knew him. All those years, living in the same house, and I had no idea who he really was." "What do you mean?" Derek turned to look at her. "The way he's been this past year, running the repair clinic, teaching those kids, building things with his hands. He lights up when he's working. I never saw that before." Ruth nodded. "Your father spent 40 years doing a job he didn't love, supporting a family, putting everyone else's needs first. He never had time for his passions, never had space for his dreams. And now he does." "Now we both do." Ruth paused. "That's the gift Colleen gave us. Not just money, but time, purpose, the freedom to become who we always could have been." Derek was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I want that too. Not the money. I know that's not mine, and it shouldn't be, but the purpose, the meaning." He looked at his hands. "I spent my whole life chasing things that didn't matter. Promotions, possessions, status, and in the end, none of it meant anything." Ruth reached over and took his hand. "It's not too late. It's never too late." "You really believe that?" "I'm 72 years old, and I just had the most meaningful year of my life. Yes, I believe it." Derek squeezed her hand. For the first time since Christmas Eve 2 years ago, mother and son sat together in peace. The second anniversary of their arrival at the mansion fell on a crisp December day. Harold and Ruth hosted a celebration at the community center, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had been part of the journey. More than 200 people gathered in the great hall, transformed for the occasion with lights and greenery. There were residents from Second Chance, workers from the farm, volunteers from the kitchen, children from the after-school program. There were townspeople who had become friends, donors who had become partners, strangers who had become family. Ruth stood at the front of the room, Harold at her side, looking out at the faces she had come to love. 2 years ago, she began, Harold and I drove through a blizzard with $23 to our name. We had been thrown out by our own son, told we were too much of a burden. We had nothing, no money, no home, no hope. She paused, letting the memory settle. Today, we have everything. Not because of the money we inherited, though that certainly helped, but because of all of you. Because of this community we've built together. Because of the love we've found in the most unexpected places. Harold stepped forward. When we started the Second Chance Foundation, we thought we were helping others. We thought we were giving back. But the truth is, you've given us far more than we could ever repay. He looked around the room, at the children playing near the fireplace, at the elderly residents chatting with volunteers, at Derek standing quietly in the back, finally at peace. Colleen Ashford waited 70 years to give away her fortune. I used to think that was sad. An old woman alone in a big house, waiting for something that might never come. But now I understand. She wasn't just waiting, she was trusting. Trusting that the right people would find her gift and use it wisely. Ruth took his hand. We hope we've honored that trust. We hope we've built something she would be proud of. But the real legacy, Harold continued, isn't the buildings or the programs or the money. It's you. It's every person in this room who decided to care about someone else. Every volunteer who gave their time. Every donor who gave their resources. Every resident who gave their trust. Ruth's eyes glistened with tears. So thank you. Thank you for letting two old people be part of something bigger than themselves. Thank you for proving that it's never too late to make a difference. And thank you for being our family. The room erupted in applause. People stood, cheered, embraced. Children ran to hug Ruth and Harold. Residents wiped tears from their eyes. Even Derek, standing in the back, was crying openly, not hiding it anymore. Later that evening, after most of the guests had gone, Ruth and Harold sat together on the porch of their cottage, watching the stars emerge one by one. The mansion glowed in the distance, lights still burning in the great hall where a few stragglers lingered over coffee and conversation. The sound of laughter drifted across the grounds. Children's laughter, adult laughter, the particular joy of people who have found their place in the world. Do you remember, Ruth said softly, that night in the motel room, Christmas Eve, 2 years ago? Harold nodded. I remember thinking it was the worst night of my life. Me too. I lay awake wondering what we'd done wrong, why our own son could treat us that way, whether we'd survive the week. And now? Ruth smiled. Now I think it was the best thing that ever happened to us. Harold raised an eyebrow. Being thrown out by our son was the best thing? Not that part, but everything that came after. If Derek hadn't thrown us out, we never would have answered that phone call from the lawyer. We never would have driven through the blizzard. We never would have found the safe, or started the foundation, or built any of this. She gestured at the mansion, the farm, the community they had created. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead to the best. Sometimes being thrown away is what gives us the freedom to become something new. Harold was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Edward Ashford wrote something in one of his letters. I found it in the attic a few weeks ago. What did it say? He said, the measure of a life is not what you accumulate, but what you give away. Not what you hold on to, but what you release. Not what you build for yourself, but what you build for others. Ruth nodded slowly. He was a wise man. He was. And so was Colleen, waiting all those years, trusting that the right person would come. Do you think we were the right people? Harold turned to face his wife, this woman he had loved for more than 50 years, who had shown more strength in the past 2 years than most people show in a lifetime. I think we became the right people, he said, and that's even better. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. In the distance, the last lights in the mansion flickered off. The community farm lay quiet, fields resting for winter. The Second Chance residence was warm and safe, its residents sleeping peacefully. everything they had built, everything they had become. Ruth leaned her head against Harold's shoulder. "I love you, Harold Whitmore. I love you too, Ruth Whitmore, more today than the day I married you, more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. What do you think comes next?" Harold considered the question. "More of the same, I hope. More helping, more building, more second chances. Until we're done, until it's our turn to pass the torch." Ruth smiled. "I hope that's a long time from now." "Me too. But whenever it comes, I'll be ready. Because I know what we've built will last. It'll keep going, keep growing, keep helping people long after we're gone." They sat together until the moon rose high, casting silver light across the grounds. Somewhere in the trees an owl called. Somewhere in the distance a car passed on the highway, carrying strangers toward their own unknown futures. Ruth closed her eyes and listened to the silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of peace, of completion, of a life well lived. "Harold?" "Yes?" "Thank you." "For what?" "For everything. For 54 years of marriage. For never giving up. For driving through that blizzard. For believing we could do this." She opened her eyes and looked at him. "For being my partner in everything." Harold's eyes were wet. "I should be thanking you. You're the one who had the vision, the one who knew what Colleen's gift was really for. We figured it out together, like we've figured out everything else." He nodded. "Together. Always together." They rose from their chairs, old bones creaking, and walked inside. The cottage was warm, cozy, filled with the small treasures they'd collected over their lives: photographs, books, Ruth's knitting basket, Harold's toolbox. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't worth millions of dollars. But it was home. Ruth paused at the door to their bedroom and looked back at Harold. "You know what the best part is?" she asked. "What?" 2 years ago we had nothing. No money, no home, no family. We were thrown away like garbage by the people who should have loved us most. "That's the best part?" Ruth smiled, a smile full of peace and gratitude, and something that looked very much like joy. "The best part is that we found something better. We found a family that chose us, a community that needed us, a purpose that fulfilled us." She reached for his hand. "We lost everything, and we gained the world." Harold squeezed her hand. "Colleen would be proud." "I hope so. I really hope so." They walked into their bedroom and closed the door. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. The mansion stood silent and strong, filled with dreams waiting to be dreamed, and in the cottage behind it, 2 elderly people who had been thrown away learned, finally, that their story was just beginning. Because sometimes the people who have the least give the most. Sometimes the ones who are forgotten become the ones who remember everyone else. And sometimes, just sometimes, the ones who are thrown away are exactly the ones who rebuild everything. Anyone can start over if they're willing to let go of the past and embrace the possibility of tomorrow. Anyone can find purpose if they look beyond themselves and reach out to others. And anyone, no matter how old, how broken, how forgotten, can become exactly who they were always meant to be. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories waiting to move you. Click to keep riding with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that second chances can change the world.